Today we are diving deep into a text called the Apocalypse of Elijah and its possible connections to Syriac Christianity. It's going to be a fascinating exploration, and it's based on research by Andrei Mubarak. He's a teacher and tour guide based in Jerusalem, and his focus is the Aramaic roots of the Christian faith. If you want to learn more about him and his work, you can check out his website, www.twinsbiblicalacademy. But yeah, let's jump right into it. What makes this text so intriguing?
What makes this deep dive really interesting is we're dealing with a text that kind of exists in a liminal space. We have this ancient work, the Apocalypse of Elijah, but there's no Syriac version that we know of. So the question we're going to be looking into today is, could this text have influenced Syriac Christianity even without a direct translation?
Okay, so we're starting off with a puzzle then. Before we get too deep into that, though, let's back up a bit. For anyone who might not be familiar, what is the Apocalypse of Elijah?
Well, it's what's known as a pseudepigraphal text, meaning that it's attributed to someone, in this case the prophet Elijah, who likely didn't actually write it. And this was a common practice in ancient times. And it belongs to the genre of Jewish and Christian apocalyptic literature. So you have visions and prophecies about the end times and divine intervention.
So kind of an end of days vibe, lots of dramatic imagery.
Exactly, yeah. It's thought to have been written sometime between the 2nd and 4th century CE, which was a period of immense change and upheaval in the Roman Empire. A lot of people were looking for answers and reassurance about the future, and apocalyptic ideas provided a framework for understanding the chaos and uncertainty.
That makes sense. If you're living through political turmoil or persecution or natural disasters, it's natural to wonder if the world is coming to an end. But this is where it gets even more interesting. The main surviving versions of the Apocalypse of Elijah that we have are in Coptic. So where does Syriac Christianity come into play here?
That's the real mystery. While the main texts that we have are not in Syriac, there are fragments in Greek, and there are hints of the Apocalypse of Elijah in Ethiopic and Syriac traditions. And this is where Andrei's research comes in. He points to the cultural and linguistic connections between these different Christian communities. And he suggests that the Apocalypse of Elijah's ideas might have made their way around even without a full Syriac translation.
So we're looking for traces of its influence on Syriac Christianity, even if we don't have a Syriac manuscript. Before we go on that hunt, though, can you give us a little bit of background on Syriac script itself? Why is it so important?
Syriac script is really crucial because it was the language of the heart for many early Christian communities in the Near East. It's a dialect of Middle Aramaic, which was the language widely spoken in the region where Christianity first spread. And so it served as a bridge between Jewish and Christian traditions, and it became the language for religious writings and ceremonies for many early Christians, especially in Edessa, which is modern-day Urfa in Turkey.
So if we want to understand early Christianity in this region, we need to understand Syriac. It's not just about the script, but about the culture and the communities it represents.
Exactly. By the 2nd century CE, Syriac script had evolved into distinct styles like Estrangela, Serto, and Madhya, reflecting the evolution of Syriac culture and the spread of Christianity. And what's really interesting is that Syriac Christians were heavily involved in preserving early Christian writings, and their literature often featured apocalyptic themes.
Okay, so we have this thriving Syriac Christian community translating and interpreting texts, and they're drawn to apocalyptic ideas. Sounds like fertile ground for a text like the Apocalypse of Elijah to take root, even if it wasn't directly translated into Syriac.
You're catching on quick. That's what we're going to explore next time. We'll be examining the thematic connections between the Apocalypse of Elijah and other apocalyptic Syriac works. We'll look for any clues that reveal its hidden influence.
Sounds good. I'm excited to get into it. Okay, so let's get into those thematic connections. You mentioned that the Apocalypse of Elijah shares some common ground with other Syriac apocalyptic works. So what are some specific examples?
One really striking parallel is the portrayal of the Antichrist. So this figure in the Apocalypse of Elijah, he's a deceiver, he leads people astray, and it ushers in this period of chaos and tribulation. And what's interesting is this theme of the deceptive Antichrist is really prominent in this other Syriac text. It's called the Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, and it's from the 7th century.
So even though they were written centuries apart, they're both dealing with this idea of a figure who represents deception and threatens faith and social order. This is a pretty powerful image, and it seems like a pretty enduring anxiety.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And it's not just the Antichrist either. Both texts use really vivid imagery to depict the end times. You see descriptions of cosmic chaos and wars and famines and just like a decline in morality. And these are very classic apocalyptic tropes. And their presence in both the Apocalypse of Elijah and Syriac apocalyptic literature suggests this like shared language for expressing anxieties about the world and the threat of divine judgment.
Yeah, I'm starting to see how these texts could have been part of a larger conversation about the end times within Syriac Christianity. They're using the similar imagery and themes and tapping into that shared understanding of how the world might end.
Right. And we can't forget the theme of resurrection and judgment, which is so central to both the Apocalypse of Elijah and Syriac Christian beliefs. The idea that the righteous will be resurrected and the wicked will face judgment, that aligns really well with the Syriac theological emphasis on Christ's victory over death.
Yeah, I see that. If you believe in the ultimate triumph of good over evil and the promise of a future resurrection, then the apocalyptic scenarios in these texts, they become less about fear and more about a righteous reckoning, like a reordering of the world according to divine justice.
Exactly. But there are even more connections beyond these broad thematic similarities. There are also some linguistic and cultural clues that point to a more subtle influence of the Apocalypse of Elijah on Syriac Christianity.
Oh, this is where it gets really interesting. What kind of clues are we talking about here?
Well, consider this. Syriac is rooted in Aramaic, the language spoken by Jesus and many early Christians. And if there were Jewish apocalyptic traditions that were either written in Aramaic or influenced by Aramaic, those traditions could easily been transmitted into these Syriac-speaking Christian communities.
So like Aramaic acted as a linguistic bridge, carrying apocalyptic ideas from Jewish traditions into the world of Syriac Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. And you have to keep in mind that texts weren't always written down. Oral storytelling and the sharing of ideas through translation were incredibly important in the ancient world. So it's very possible that parts of the Apocalypse of Elijah were shared orally or in translated fragments within Syriac-speaking communities.
So even if they didn't have a complete Syriac translation, Syriac Christians might have heard snippets or paraphrases of the Apocalypse of Elijah, and those would be circulating through word of mouth or informal translations.
Exactly. And remember how we talked about how Syriac translations of other apocalyptic texts like the Book of Revelation, they often adapted the language and interpretation to fit the local context. So it's possible that a similar thing could have happened with the Apocalypse of Elijah.
So it's a process of cultural adaptation, where ideas from one text are absorbed and reinterpreted.
Exactly. And there's one other interesting clue. Certain symbols and images that appear in the Apocalypse of Elijah, like cosmic battles and angels and the final judgment. Those also pop up in Syriac Christian hymns and prayers and artwork.
So the Apocalypse of Elijah is tapping into a pre-existing fascination with apocalyptic imagery and symbolism in Syriac Christianity.
Exactly. It really suggests a cultural landscape where these ideas could resonate. It's not just about textual influence, it's about a shared worldview.
I see. So I'm starting to see how the Apocalypse of Elijah fits into the larger world of Syriac Christianity. But even if these themes were circulating, were they accepted by Syriac theologians and thinkers? Like, how do the ideas in the Apocalypse of Elijah line up with what Syriac Christians believed?
That's a great question. And it really gets at the heart of how Syriac Christians might have interpreted and adapted these apocalyptic ideas to fit their own theology.
So how did Syriac Christians reconcile those sometimes pretty intense images and predictions in the Apocalypse of Elijah with their own beliefs?
Well, a lot of Syriac apocalyptic writings, they focus heavily on Christ as like the triumphant king, the ultimate judge. So even though the Apocalypse of Elijah itself doesn't actually mention Christ, Syriac Christians could pretty easily interpret its message, through that kind of Christ-centered lens that they were using.
Yeah, they could have seen the divine intervention and the victory of good over evil as a symbol of Christ's power and his eventual return.
Exactly. And they were good at that, at taking these texts and kind of weaving them into their existing beliefs. Another key aspect of Syriac Christianity was asceticism. It's the practice of self-discipline and spiritual focus. And so the Apocalypse of Elijah, with its warnings about, tribulation and the call to be vigilant, all of that would have resonated with that worldview.
Like a call to be spiritually prepared, to be ready for whatever challenges might come.
Yeah. Exactly. And both the Apocalypse of Elijah and Syriac apocalyptic texts, they both offer a message of hope. They remind these communities that are being persecuted that God is in control, that justice will win out in the end, and that there's a divine kingdom waiting for the faithful.
So even in the midst of all this talk about chaos and judgment, There's this core message of resilience and faith. And that must have been really powerful for Syriac Christians, especially going through tough times.
Absolutely. It's about hope in the face of uncertainty. And it's a theme that really speaks to people across different times and cultures. But even with all these connections, we still haven't found that Syriac manuscript of the Apocalypse of Elijah. Do you think there's any chance one's still out there, just waiting to be discovered?
That's the big question, right? What do you think? Could there be more to the story?
I mean, it's possible. Remember how we talked about the Syriac lectionaries, those liturgical texts that sometimes had readings from apocalyptic works?
Hmm.
It's possible that some of those readings could have been from like a shared body of apocalyptic literature that included the Apocalypse of Elijah, even if a full Syriac translation hasn't been found.
Wow, so there could be pieces of the Apocalypse of Elijah hidden in those texts.
Yeah. And don't forget about the close connections between Coptic and Syriac Christian communities. They didn't just share theology, they shared texts and traditions. So it's possible that apocalyptic writings, even the Apocalypse of Elijah, they might have, traveled between those groups.
It's like a network of shared knowledge, and ideas are moving across cultures and languages.
Exactly. Oh, and one more piece. Syriac authors, they often quoted or paraphrased apocalyptic imagery in their own writing. Take Ephraim the Syrian. He was a hymnographer, and he lived in the 4th century. His work is full of these apocalyptic themes, these vivid descriptions that kind of echo the Apocalypse of Elijah.
So even if he didn't have a Syriac copy of the Apocalypse of Elijah, his writing shows that he was familiar with those ideas, like they were already floating around.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole thing so interesting. We're tracing this text through history, exploring its influence even without a direct translation. It really reminds you that ideas, how they spread, it's complex. And that influence can be, subtle.
So what's the takeaway for our listeners today? Why should they care about this ancient text and its possible connection to Syriac Christianity?
I think this deep dive shows the power of ideas and the way that different cultures connect and interact with each other, even without a Syriac manuscript. The Apocalypse of Elijah's themes, its imagery, those might have shaped the way Syriac Christians thought about the end times. It might have even influenced their whole understanding of hope, of judgment, of divine intervention.
Yeah. It's like, exploration and discovery isn't always about getting a clear answer. Sometimes it's about asking good questions, thinking about things from different perspectives, and just appreciating how complex history is.
Exactly. And hey, maybe someday a Syriac version of the Apocalypse of Elijah will turn up. And it'll give us even more insight into early Christianity and into the amazing world of Syriac literature. But until then, we keep searching, keep asking questions.
That's right. Thanks for joining us on this journey, everyone. Until next time, keep exploring and keep those minds open.